In a strange but not at all unexpected series of events, the Canadian Liberal government is essentially lobbying itself to push racist ideology onto impressionable school children through this weird reverse engineering toolkit. But is the group who developed this toolkit as innocuous as they're portrayed to be? For Rebel News, I'm Tamara Ugolini, bringing you the Canadian government-funded Anti-Hate Network's toolkit titled Confronting and Preventing Hate in Canadian Schools. This new resource guide will be disseminated throughout Canadian schools, and as reported by Blacklock's, Diversity Minister Ahmed Hussein approved a $268,400 grant to fund the guide. The Canadian Anti-Hate Network, also called CAHN or simply Anti-Hate Network, is a federally subsidized group that also receives an identical $268,400 federal grant to operate its website.
And that's what parents want their kids to be. They want their kids to be in a space where they're given the supports that they need to become what they want to be, to love who they love, and to support each other. And I always like to say that in Canada, diversity is a fact, but inclusion is a choice. Inclusion is a choice that we must make, and inclusion is something that we must fight for every single day.
On the second page of the toolkit, it says that it was, quote, adapted from Confronting White Nationalism in Schools, developed by the Western States Center in the United States. This is another example where the Justin Trudeau Liberals love to insert United States-based socio-political issues into Canada to further divide and gaslight us. We've seen it most recently with the continually peaceful trucker convoy that took to the nation's capital at the end of January of this year, where state broadcasters spread misinformation about the convoy and its intentions. Their talking points included neo-Nazi participants, where one sole instance was denounced and called out as a plant at the scene. They tried to pin some nearby hallway smoldering as an arson attempt by convoy participants, which has turned out to be entirely unrelated. They tried to say that the convoy was foreign funded, which has also turned out to be a lie.
But there is concern that Russian actors could be continuing to fuel things as this protest grows, but perhaps even instigating it from the outset.
Well, again, I'm going to defer to our partners in the public safety, the trained officials and experts in that area.
And the Liberals all lied when they said that the police asked for additional powers to deal with protesters.
It was only after we got advice from law enforcement that we invoked the Emergencies Act. We invoked the Emergencies Act after we received advice from law enforcement. The advice we received was to invoke the Emergencies Act.
But that didn't stop far-left politicians from eating it up and regurgitating the propaganda, further inciting hate and division between Canadians who were continually being misled by their televisions and those who were at the forefront of denouncing unjust and unwarranted government COVID policies. See, when injustices actually plague us, all of these activists, inclusivity, tolerant groups are silent, or even worse, advocate behind it. They wanted to force mask raped victims and the child with sensory processing disorder. They didn't care if you lost your job because you didn't want to take a non-sterilizing novel injection. And they certainly didn't care if your forced isolation provoked you into a downward suicidal spiral because it was supposed to be for the greater good, at the sacrifice of the individual.
There's always a risk to having any therapeutic versus a benefit. You want to make sure there's a very strong benefit versus the risk.
And dictator Trudeau so badly wanted the trucker convoy to be Canada's January 6th that he and his government didn't even bother to fact check any of the rhetoric being spread by the propaganda arm of that same government. And now his own government is funding radical ideologies being born out of social justice warriors in the United States and putting the weight on the shoulders of Canadian school children. The basis of this Canadian toolkit is basically just verbatim what the US one said, switching out some of the buzzwords like white nationalism for hate-promoting social movements. And they got $260,000 to basically just copy and paste this indoctrination toolkit as though that's really the priority during record runaway inflation and a looming recession. I mean, could these people be any more out of touch? So anyway, the far left anti-hate network released this toolkit and workshops with the goal of supplementing, quote, a comprehensive anti-racism education program. It will give you the tools to identify when a young person is consuming hate propaganda and is becoming radicalized, and to intervene as early as possible before the situation escalates. They define hate as more than a dislike. It is the dehumanization or discrimination against specific groups on the basis of race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, and disability. They relate this only to white supremacy and white nationalism, and that advocating for a white ethno-state is inherently anti-immigrant, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, and anti-Black. But that's not all. Apparently, these groups also conduct their work in secret, without publicly mentioning race or religion, often using coded messaging to launder or disguise the true intention. This doesn't sound paranoid at all, because they go on to write that hatred never stops at BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. Naturally, it also includes misogyny and specifically anti-trans messaging. Hate-promoting individuals often believe that women, girls, and the 2S LGBTQIA plus squared to the power of 2 community are also changing the demographic and eroding the fabric of society. No, I think there might just be an issue with how the entire fabric of our society must apparently revolve around this flawed ideal of social justice. Then they go through each listed ideology from describing white nationalism, apparently many of whom believe that Canada should go back to pre-1967 days when Canada was more white. But how do they define white? Is it skin color, country of origin? And how far back should we go? I mean, I'm mostly pale and white, but I'm also third generation German and Italian and a little bit of French Canadian mixed in there too, which I think is the typical Canadian. We're mutts. We're a mix of cultures, of languages, and skin colors. And I've literally never seen anybody asking for this. So are they taking some fringe anonymous wackadoodle on Twitter and trying to apply it to the entire right? Talk about inflammatory. The next listed ideology is alt-right, where they refer to mainstream conservative political parties by name as being targets of infiltration. Remember that this is a document funded directly by the Liberal government of Canada. The usual suspects are up next, from anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, misogyny and anti-feminism, anti-2S LGBTQ plus squared to the power of 2. They basically say a lot of fluff but offer no tangible way to actually address anything that these apparently marginalized groups claim to suffer from, other than, of course, censorship of everyone else. The next part of the toolkit is about social media and recruitment. They list TikTok, Telegram, and streaming platforms as ways that the alt-right recruits people. So obviously, to counteract that, they're going to take this and implement their way of thinking into all of our publicly funded schools. And what mainstream conservative politician hasn't been labeled as far right these days? There's Pierre Poilievre. His Venezuelan wife and his Venezuelan children likely would be shocked to hear that he's alt-right. In another article by Global News, Rachel Gilmore quotes Evan Balgord, who is the Anti-Hate Network's executive director, and he also refers to Poilievre as far-right. Anti-Hate Network's advisory board member Barbara Perry thinks that free speech is a far-right concept, which is where the how to use the toolkit comes into play here. The resource isn't intended to replace anti-racist curriculum or programs because, hint, those already exist and are in place. Rather, it, quote, is a supplementary support aimed specifically at identifying and attempting to deal with involvement in far-right social movements potentially leading to violence. After several pages of examples, there is a list of memes. Oddly, they leave out some of the more obvious symbols like the swastika. It's weird, but let's scroll through. Pepe the Frog is obviously a racist. Canada's original flag, too, is apparently a hate symbol, but only in some context, because you can never be too sure when it comes to those pesky white nationalists that I have literally never met. And here is Evan Balgord, Executive Director of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, calling the word freedom racist. But does the Anti-Hate Network really care about anti-hate? Toronto lawyer Caryma Sa'd, who is a political commentator / cartoonist, would beg to question that. While I don't necessarily agree with her approach or angle on many things, I respect and appreciate that she is a liberated Muslim woman using her freedom of expression to do on-the-ground citizen journalism. But apparently the Anti-Hate Network didn't like how she was going about it and sought to silence her in a bizarre unfolding of bullying and intimidation techniques. Look at some of her Twitter feed. On July 5th, Caryma says that the Anti-Hate Network confuses bullying with activism after she was targeted by people mooning her and her cameraman. This is a classic immature schoolyard antic that shows the level of intellect present here. But the main event took place a year ago in July 2021, but was only denounced by Caryma in April of this year, 2022. Her thread reads, "If confused over misgivings about the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, read on. The thread involves former neo-Nazi and current board member Liz Moore and journo/DJ Morgan Yu, whose reflection appears in a photo that he took of Caryma's unattended unit. She notes that her personal story is a microcosm. Apparently, Caryma was planning on interviewing unapologetic COVID dissident Chris Sky when Liz Moore, again, that's that neo-Nazi board member that she refers to, asked Caryma to reconsider. Caryma declined, noting that she does not take cues on fighting racism from white women, especially former white supremacists. Caryma further says something here that I'm quite agreeable to. Radicalization is a daunting phenomenon, but suppressing speech isn't the answer. Censorship stifles the process by which we search for truth. Censorship limits our ability to actually agree on what is and what isn't dangerous. To this, the Anti-Hate Network organized a blockade of the venue where Caryma was to interview Sky. Caryma claims that protesters helped create a confrontational situation, noting that there was ample space to protest her show without relying on physical intimidation. The online bullying and harassment apparently came from accounts either loosely or directly related to the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. The creepiest part is that through communication with the network, Sa'd discovered that Yu attended her unit before she even announced her intention to interview Sky. Sa'd refers to all of this as an active, coordinated, and ongoing campaign against her. Similar to what I've outlined already, Sa'd also uncovered that the Anti-Hate Network receives federal funding and uses their platform to promote legislation that limits speech. She closes her thread with the reiteration that it's not censoring hate that is bad. It's that if we are too quick to define something as hateful, we compromise the very essence of the political process in our democracy. So I had previously reached out to Sa'd to see if she would discuss this with me in a scheduled interview, but due to the ongoing litigation around this case, she politely declined. So what is this anti-hate network? Is it anti-hate or a systemic process in which certain lobby groups who are directly funded by the Liberal government, i.e. Canadian taxpayers, will initiate slow legislative changes by indoctrinating school children with their socio-political goals? But the moral of the story here is, even if you are ultra-progressive, if you're not ideologically pure, according to these progressive Puritans, you'll get a witch trial of your own. For Rebel News, I'm Tamara Ugolini. Caryma Sa'd is right. Suppressing speech isn't the answer to stopping radicalization. Actually, I think that censorship openly welcomes radical ideologies to further fester because then the ideas cannot be scrutinized, which I think is why the government should not have the ability to control social media platforms, as the Justin Trudeau Liberals continually seek to do through regulation and legislation. If you agree, check out our reporting and sign our petition at stopthecensorship.ca. That's stopthecensorship.ca.